Welcome back, everybody. Last lecture of the semester, Digital Technologies and Cinema Part 2. I'm Dr. Dan. Good to be back. Let's get started. So, really, just one big concept for this lecture, remediation. It's the subject of the book from which the reading this week is drawn. Really interesting subject. I'm betting that most of you, by the time that this lecture is done, will say, oh, I know what this is. I've seen this. But you may right now be saying, what does this term mean? Because it's not a term that is used often. But what it means, according to Bolter and Grusin, is the way that films, or other media, it's not just films that does this, but film class, we'll talk about films, describing how they are emulating or incorporating elements from other media. So thinking back to our toolkit from the first unit of the course, where we talked about mise en scène and editing and cinematography, increasingly as we move in through the 21st century, films are starting to take other formal devices from media beyond just the cinematic. So they're expanding, filmmakers have been expanding their toolkits with material from video games, comic books, television, social media, and the internet. I mean, the list goes on and on. This is just a partial list, but cinema is constantly, and this is part of its special power as a medium, because it's a visual medium, an auditory medium, a performance medium, a medium where reality and animation can coexist. It is just very easy for creative filmmakers to kind of look beyond the borders of their own medium and see things in these other media that they say, hey, what if we try to work this with the traditional toolkit, the mise en scène, the cinematography, the editing? What's going to happen because of that? Well, and the answer is often really interesting things. Just a couple of examples from the last 20 years or so that you may or may not be familiar with to illustrate some of these points about how remediation works. I, as you may or may not know, am a big video game player. So I'm really fascinated to see and study how cinema has influenced video games. I'm sure many of you can think of at least one video game that, like, in one way, shape, or form, through cutscenes or through certain kinds of stories that are being told, are borrowing heavily from the scenarios of Hollywood cinema. And the interesting thing is that cinema has repaid the favor, so to speak, by adapting not just the stories that could be video game stories or stories about video games, Gamer being an example of that one. The narrative of that film very heavily focused on the experience of being a video game player in contemporary, a really exaggerated version of our modern society. And Hardcore Henry, the plot of that film, if you see him, just look at the poster. Roboticized, militarized, half man, half machine, the world's first super soldier. I mean, that is literally the plot of like 50% of video games ever. Exaggerating a little bit there, obviously, but just goes to show you that the stories get pulled in. But, I mean, you don't want to just be thinking about content. This is the main theme I've been harping on over and over again throughout this course. You never want to just think about content. It is not just that these films are adapting narratives from video games. It's also that, in the case of Hardcore Henry, the entire film is being shot from a first-person perspective. Gamer, as you can kind of tell from the poster, is littering its screen with the kinds of graphical information about hit points and save data and so on that you normally see when you play a video game, but you never really see in cinematic images. And Gamer is really unique for kind of like loading up the frame with like data. It's really cool. A few other examples to kind of underscore the way that this is not just a content-based process, but is also a formal process. Look at the way comic book films have been adapted. I remember when I was a freshman in college, the big movie was Sin City. That came out when I was 18, and everybody, not Sin City, I'm sorry, 300. Everybody saw 300. And the thing that was really unique about 300 was it wasn't just adapting the Frank Miller comic book about the 300 Spartans and their war against the Persians and all that good stuff. It was also, as much as it could, trying to replicate the cel-shaded, extremely kind of stylized animation that characterizes a graphic novel, but doing so within the context of like a live action film. So in some senses, it was trying to kind of like recreate like what is in effect an animated medium to some degree, the comic book, as a live action film. So you have this really interesting process of remediating this static graphic visual medium into a reality-based cinematic medium. So that's a great example. Check it out. Avengers is a really, really interesting case too, because it's actually, I think, I would argue it's remediating at least two different media. First and most obviously, it is pulling a lot of its comic books or its narratives from the comic books by Stan Lee and other talented artists and writers at Marvel. And very much just taking these characters, taking story arcs and dramatic conflicts and so on and so forth from like comic books that in some cases date back to the 1960s for some of these characters. And it's also, of course, if you are a comic book reader, the way that these films kind of take part as a kind of serialized arc where threads will be set up in one film that get resolved in another film like several years later is very comic book-like. But I would also argue that the Avengers films owe as much to television as they do to comic books for some of their visual style and their narrative structure. Because if you really look at the way, first of all, if you look at like the production history behind these films, you notice that half of the people who have directed or written these Avengers films started in television. Joss Whedon comes to mind. The Russo brothers, by the way, Russo brothers are Iowa students. At least one of them was, and their careers start in TV. You know, like Joss Whedon with Buffy, the Russo brothers with a lot of episodes of Community, and the visual style of these films, which favors a lot of medium close-ups with not really a lot of complex use of mise-en-scène, if I'm being really honest. Like a lot of just kind of nondescript cityscapes and kind of like gray metallic sort of meeting rooms is often where many of the Avengers films kind of end up at some point. And that is a very, very televisual use of visual kind of storytelling. I'm not saying that like as a criticism. Like television is a really wonderful medium, but it's clearly being designed, yes, initially for the theatrical experience, but at the end of the day, they know that they're going to be using these kinds of images because they play really well on smaller TV screens. And also, I would point to the way the films are structured as effectively a longer and more expensive television show. Like you have films that set up conflicts much like a pilot in a TV season would, or the season premiere of a new season. You have a lot of stuff in the middle where conflict is being developed and maybe there are some unexpected twists along the way. but generally everyone's just kind of like treading water, narratively speaking. And then you build up to the climactic films in the form of Endgame and, gosh, I'm terrible with the names, Endgame and the other one that came before it, Infinity War. And they function very much as like a big film version of like a 2-part season finale or something of that nature. So The Avengers is really great. It's not my favorite movie. It's not a movie that I personally find myself watching very frequently. But cinematically, they're really interesting because they are arguably the biggest and most visible example of how Hollywood cinema is remediating other media, including comic books and TV, in a very kind of complex kind of way. Like, so a film that seemingly is just designed to just be a fun, kind of entertaining movie is really interesting because you see these processes at work on the biggest possible stage, it seems. Couple of other examples. Just again, I'm trying to provide y'all a sense of how this process, which again, like you may not know the word remediation, but this process is really really dominates so much media. And I would argue that going forward into the next 50 years of cinema, 100 years of cinema, this is only going to happen more frequently. As I think you can brilliantly see through films that are like remediating the internet. It's a really, really fascinating subgenre of films that's merged within the last 10, 15 years. But you can see some of these films, they take a wide different array of different ways of approaching this challenge of remediating the internet. And one way that you saw very early on, so The Net, which, wow, what a wacky movie. Such a wacky movie. You want to go see what people in the 90s thought the internet was going to be. Go watch this movie with Sandra Bullock. Or, frankly, just go watch The Social Network. Because of both of these films, what's really interesting about it is the internet is very much the subject of the film, but stylistically, these are very traditional Hollywood films in many respects. Like they're set up narratively the way traditional Hollywood films are. You have like a first act where characters are established, goals are established, conflict is generated. A second act where things develop and complications happen, and then a third act where it all comes to a head. Narratively, these are Hollywood films. Stylistically, they are Hollywood films. They use the traditional combination of master shots and close-ups and medium shots. Continuity editing dominates. Real, quote-unquote, realistic use of film style, not really in most cases trying to get you to notice the style for its own sake. You are instead asked to watch characters interacting and you're asked to sort of pretend that you are the fly on the wall in this world and you're just kind of watching these things play out. But doing that in relation to narratives about the internet. So what I'm saying here is that, again, these are not my favorite films. These are not films I'm just ever going to really sit down and watch. As much as I admire The Social Network and as much as I enjoyed watching The Net the first time, these are not movies I'm necessarily going to spend a lot of time with. But nonetheless, I find them really cinematically fascinating because you see one representational system, the cinema that I just described, engaging with this new medium and that is fundamentally different from it in so many ways. And it's interesting because you see this aesthetic tension between old and new that parallels in a lot of cases the kind of cautionary tale kind of thing that you see happening in both of these films and many, many others that I could have chosen around how if you go on the internet is going to, in the Net's case, it's if you go on the internet, you're going to lose all of your shit, your driver's license, your credit cards, your bank account. It's like chat rooms are bad, y'all. That's the message of the Net. And the Social Network very much is, if you spend too much time on, social media, you're going to just like, no one's going to want to be around you, or vice versa. The people who invented social media are antisocial, crazy people. So it's interesting. It's interesting to think about the relationship between media kind of playing out in these films. It's very tense. But, that's a different story. It's a different story when you look at smaller films, independent films kind of produced for the international kind of art circuit. So as opposed to the Hollywood films we just looked at, because these are films where you are much more likely to see not just remediation of content, not just films repurposing stories about the internet or video games or whatever, but also absorbing the experience of using the internet into their very form. So both of these films are produced for very, very little money, which helps. And they both largely take place through some kind of computer interface. Redacted is basically a film that was kind of like approximating the experience of watching a lot of like atrocity footage on YouTube. So it's kind of being produced late into the second Iraq War, so near the end of George W. Bush's presidency, when a lot of Americans were realizing that the Iraq War is imposing significant costs, both financially, how much the war was costing, and also emotionally in terms of like what soldiers were being asked to do. And it just wasn't really, accomplishing what we had hoped it would accomplish. And there were a number of people who at that point were taking advantage of the fact that video sharing websites like YouTube, and at the time actually would have been Google Videos, which I don't know if anyone else remembers Google Videos. Those were fun. We used to, in high school, sit around and just watch Google videos of cats, and it was like the most mind-blowing thing in 2006, let me tell you. And this is kind of like, creating that experience, but around the experience of sifting through the internet and finding footage of wartime bad things happening that, people were uploading and sharing on torrents as a means of protesting or raising awareness, or in some cases just because it was they really got off on snuff footage. The motivations are endless. But the film kind of simulates that experience. It's basically a lot of different video clips, some of which are being kind of filmed by the soldiers themselves. It takes place in the Iraq War. Some of which are being shot by a French documentary team, framing the soldiers and their relationships with civilians in very particular ways. Some of the footage is shot by Iraqi civilians and insurgents. And the film is just kind of overlapping these different perspectives as it tells its narrative about some horrific crimes perpetuated by these soldiers in the course of their time over in Iraq. Unfriended is another example I think I've mentioned elsewhere in my lectures, but this is a really low budget horror film that takes place entirely on a computer interface. So something similar to what Searching did, but even more kind of aggressively embracing the alien kind of weirdness of the computer interface. It's really a film that kind of asks you to say, look at how much time we spend looking at little arrow cursors and file icons, and how weird and alienating is this experience at the end of the day. So anyway, this all leads around to the final film that I've asked you to watch, Searching, directed by Anish Shiganti, starring John Cho. A really, really excellent film. This is just a wonderful film, I think, to end the semester on for any number of reasons. But the big reason that I've chosen this as our capstone is because you have in this film a crystal clear demonstration of the enduring staying power of Hollywood's like narrative conventions, like all of the things that we have been talking about as distinguishing like Hollywood storytelling from other modes of storytelling are fully on display in this film. The poster is really apt, like Hitchcock levels of suspense. That is the film is very, very happy that it is being compared to the paradigmatic, like classical Hollywood filmmaker from like the 40s and 50s. Because it's doing all of those things. It's like it's got like, a clearly defined protagonist with like strong goals. The film is organized around this cause-effect sequence where every particular action has consequences and leads to reactions and advances the story. It also, of course, has a very traditional division of gendered labor. John Cho is the hero. He is looking for his daughter, who for much of the film is kind of a symbol or an image or a goal rather than a character, although, of course, the film complicates that distinction by fleshing out her character over the course of the film. But anyway, he is defined in relation to her. She is the goal. He also interacts with the Deborah Messing character, who at first takes the role of sidekick helper and later kind of takes the role of villain. And in either case, this is just, again, like a very time-honored thing that Hollywood films have been doing for many, many years. Now, the spin, of course, we have to mention is that Searching is kind of breaking down some of the racial barriers that traditionally adhere around Hollywood cinema. So like with Deja Vu, this is a great example of a film that is kind of pushing forward and being more progressive than historically what Hollywood films have done. But in some ways, it is also just kind of clinging fast to these traditional storytelling tropes. But that's one reason I've selected this film. The other reason that I've selected this film is because it is a really, really creative example of like the power of cinema to like absorb and reproduce other media and kind of take these other things that it finds in the other arts and pulls it into, again, like what I was describing as a very solid, sturdy, classical Hollywood framework. And the end result is just really wonderful. I mean, it's not a perfect film, in spite of what that other quote says. It is not absolute perfection. There are definitely some things about it there we could quibble with, but for its ability to get you excited about the possibilities of cinema as a medium, among recent films, this is second to none. You can tell that the people who were involved with this production knew that what they were doing was not the norm and were happy to just run with it, either because they didn't know enough to be afraid of taking these risks or because they just, the arrogance of youth, like the sort of commitments that you have, you know in your gut, like this is the way to do it. But this is a good point to just maybe pause and tell you a little bit about the director, Anish Shiganti, who is a really great model for maybe some of y'all to emulate in terms of how he's charted a path to the movie industry. We've been talking all semester about how these different filmmakers have sort of gotten into the filmmaking business, and one of the points I've been trying to make, however implicitly, is that like there are many, many different paths to a career involving the arts in some way, shape, or form. And even before these directors like Adami Goyan and Shiganti and Tarsem Singh and so on and so forth, even before they became film directors, their careers demonstrate the multifarious possibilities that are available to people to express their love of creativity and hopefully make a little money doing so. But Shiganti is, when he made Searching, he was in his like mid to late 20s. He was like 27, I think. And before he got into Searching, which was his first film, he had done a lot of like work for Google and for different tech companies, and had filmed very famously, for people who follow these things, filmed a short 1-minute advertisement using Google Glass called Seeds that was just, people like saw this at like film festivals, like little short film festivals that he, you know, kind of took it to, and we're just like, wow, this is just great. Available on YouTube. It's really, really short. I would highly recommend just taking a quick look at it at some point. Just to give you, again, a sense of like where Shiganti is coming from, like what kinds of things he's doing before he jumps into the deep end with Searching, which got to have you this little picture of Shiganti and John Cho, just because I want you to sort of see just a glimpse of like the weirdness of this production. I mean, so much of this movie is just John Cho kind of looking into a computer screen, which, saying this in 2020, it's like, yeah, well, you know, now that's our lived reality. Now we're all just really familiar with that. And, you know, we can just, we've gotten better, hopefully, just the weird experience of like what I'm doing right now, staring at a computer screen and talking to myself, but hoping that you will listen to this later and find it useful or entertaining or some combination of the two. But, you know, in 2017, 2018, when they are making this film, this is not the everyday experience. And it's a very weird thing that John Cho is doing, just kind of acting, you know, sort of in these small, like kind of closed in spaces a lot of the time, looking at a computer screen or cell phone screen and just kind of acting like that instead of before a big 35 millimeter camera. And so they talk in the interviews and commentary tracks about, you know, the challenges sort of getting used to that. But the other thing that really kind of jumps out at me about this image, and just other things that I have read about the production of this film, is, you know, you see really here just how small scale a lot of this is compared to like what David Fincher or Michael Bay or Christopher Nolan will have on their sets. And this smallness, especially the smallness of scale, especially in the context of the fact that these are, you know, Shiganti is a young, you know, kid, you know, not much older than most of y'all who are listening to this, presumably. And, you know, it's just this is just, to me, looks like so much like an extension of something that you might do as like a student, you know, a student film. And so I'm saying all of this, and, you know, the parallel that I really like want to bring up, just to bring things full circle, just to kind of tie it all back to what we've been talking about since the beginning. But think back to Citizen Kane. I mean, this is, you know, Searching is in some ways Shiganti's Citizen Kane, if only because they are both, Orson Welles and Anish Shiganti, in their like mid-20s when they make this film. And like, so in both films you have this like really wonderful kind of like love of the medium, like that is on display. Like, I mean, Orson Welles famously says that he loved making Citizen Kane as his first film because a Hollywood movie set was like the best electric toy set, train set a boy could hope for. And it's just like, that's just a, you know, it's just that tells you everything you need to know about the enthusiasm and excitement that Welles felt about getting to make a Hollywood film. And it's all over the screen in that film. And it's the same thing with Searching. I mean, Searching will probably not occupy the same lofty cultural status as Citizen Kane. Although who knows? I mean, maybe 50 years goes by and it cracks the Sight and Sound list or the AFI's list. But even if it doesn't, you know, get elevated to the top spot on the pyramid. Both of these films are really, really great companion pieces to me because they are both so in love with what cinema can do. Like what the uniqueness of cinema to show us images of people and places and things and tell us a story that moves us emotionally. Like you see this in Citizen Kane, you see it in Searching. But the other thing that you see in both of these films is cinema being synthesized with other media. Citizen Kane, we didn't talk about this too much at the beginning of the semester, but Citizen Kane is very much remediating radio. Because radio is what Orson Welles knew before and theater as well. It's remediating both of these devices. The overlapping dialogue that Citizen Kane famously contributes to American cinema is just standard practice in radio. That deep stage blocking that we did talk so extensively about is just a way to approximate the real-time duration of a theatrical production, which is what Welles was doing as a teenager. Theater. And Shiganti is doing the same thing. He's taking the media that he knows really well, that you know really well, because we're all either millennial or iGen or Gen Y or whatever it is that we call ourselves. And so we've all grown up with these technologies and with these tools, and it's just really exciting, regardless of any quibbles we can have with the plotting of Searching or just some of the gender tropes it introduces. The excitement about how cinema can absorb and reinvent other media like radio, like painting, like the internet, like comic books, like video games, is palpable in Searching, no less than in Citizen Kane. So yeah, just some thoughts to contribute. A couple of other things just to kind of give you a sense of how Shiganti is kind of getting into this film. Just a list of a few of his favorite films, and you can really see it's a very varied list. You have Hollywood films, like a lot of recent Hollywood films, which is very predictable given these are the films Shiganti is watching when he's 12, 13, 14. But also you have older Hollywood films from the late 60s. You have international cinema, an early Bong Joon-ho film, really, really great film, Memories of Murder. And so I'm leaving you this list just to give you a sense. Again, if you are interested in a career in the film industry, you really owe it to yourself to have a list of favorite films that is as weird and as wide-ranging and as eclectic as possible. So don't just limit yourself to the things that you know and love already, like the Hollywood films of recent vintage. Definitely you should include a few of those, when you're thinking about what are the films that really inspire me, what are the films that I want to maybe make something like in some way, shape, or form at one point in my life. Go beyond your comfort zone. Look at some international films, look at older films, look at films that are not in your usual genres. Just be adventurous. Shiganti would tell you the same thing. Any of these filmmakers that we've been exploring would tell you the same thing. The more films that you can watch from the more places and times that you can watch them, the better your awareness of film history is, the better your work will be. So, last part of the lecture, I just want to kind of give you a few additional talking points and thinking questions to ask in relation to Searching, because there is a good chance, hint, hint, that there will be a question about Searching on the final or second exam, short answer question. And so I'm just going to talk you through a couple of talking points and let you just sort of let them percolate, let you build on them, and who knows, maybe even bring them into play on the exam. But one question that you'll really want to think about when watching Searching and preparing for the exam is just thinking about how this is a film that is adhering to those traditional principles of Hollywood narration that we've been discussing. And I'm not going to go into too much depth because, again, I want you to have the space to think through these questions yourself. while you're studying. These are things you can discuss on Friday with your final sad discussion section meetings with your TAs. So these are, but just a couple of key words to think about. You want to think about how that active-passive split of men and women is represented in Searching. Enigma resolution plotting. This is also another fancy way of saying cause and effect. Things happen that have clear causes, and you are trying to figure out what those clear causes are. It all kind of lines up at the end where everything ultimately has its place in the narrative. It's very, very efficient in that way. Psychological motivation, goal-oriented characters, that linear causality, again, another word for cause and effect, basically. Just want to be thinking about how these things are operating in Searching. Of course, the gender split is really, really worth just touching on one more time, because it's just so ubiquitous throughout the film. But something else that is very much worth thinking about is how this film is challenging some representational tropes from film history, but also reproducing others. And again, Deborah Messing's character is worth spotlighting for this point, just because of how much her character here is appropriating and reworking tropes surrounding the femme fatale from much older films. But then the big question that you'll really want to be thinking about while watching the film and beyond is just, how are these traditional elements of film being remediated, or how are they remediating computers and social media and cell phones and all of these other interfaces? And why? To what effect? How is this changing your experience of the film? And here's another way to pose that question, just to kind of think about it from a different angle. Imagine a version of Searching that had the exact same script, same dialogue, same plotting, but was filmed in a traditional style with master shots, close-ups, continuity editing, etc., etc. Would that be the same film? Substantially, the plot would be the same, the characters would be the same, but would it be the same experience? My gut answer is no, it wouldn't. But I'm going to let you tell me, why. So there's a good thing to think about. Well, I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope you got something from it and from all the other lectures in this series. If you have any questions, don't ever hesitate to contact me. But I hope you've enjoyed your journey through the movies. Hope to see you again in future contexts.